Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today, what I wanted to do is go through the parts of the 3.11.0 patch notes that caught my eye. Now, these patch notes are too big to read through and discuss every single line in them, or even to discuss a majority of them. So for that reason, I'm going to skip through a lot. I want to point out some of the things that have been sort of hot button issues on Reddit, where people have been talking a lot about, oh my god, this build that I had in mind has been destroyed, or on the flip side, holy hell, the GGG failed to nerf this, it's going to be so OP. So I want to talk about some of the things that I think are particularly noteworthy in here, without going through every single thing. So firstly, there's a bit of discussion about what the Harvest Challenge League is. Been following my channel, you would have seen a bit about this, but essentially the core idea is that it's a fresh economy as normal for a new league. Everyone's on a level playing field, so people like me that have got dozens or hundreds of Exalted Orbs in Standard aren't able to just flex that economic muscle to pick up everything that we want and to buy it straight away. Instead, everyone's on a level playing field at the start. You'll be starting new characters, starting from the beginning of the game. Now, there's a little bit of high-level overview of what happens in the Harvest Challenge League. This new character that you'll meet that will enlist you to plant a garden for her and use a whole bunch of seeds that you'll find while you're exploring other maps. And then these harvested monsters will yield their life force, which you can then use for ridiculously powerful and niche crafts. It seems like one of the simpler gameplay loops that we've had in recent leagues, and actually I'm getting a lot of vibes of the Incursion League. Part of this, I think, is because the nature of the last 3 and a bit months in real-world events is that grinding gear games have had significant disruptions to their development, and they've wanted to keep working on Path of Exile 2 as well. So for that reason, less developer time has been spent on the Harvest League than has been spent on some of the other previous leagues. I think that's the right decision to make. It does mean that I don't expect the Harvest League to necessarily last as long as some of the previous leagues have, in terms of its sort of longevity of exciting things to do. But I do think it's going to be pretty crazy. I get a real sense, actually, that this league's going to have a lot of the feel of the Dark Shrine League, which if people didn't play in it, it was a 1 or so month league. It was the last league that Grinding Gear Games ran that wasn't according to the current schedule, where every league goes for 3 months. It was an exception to that rule, and it was a short league that had lots of zany stuff happening. Anyway, crazy crafts will be everywhere, and there's all sorts of new challenge rewards and the like. Major new content and features discusses the new skill gems. There's no new information here. There's a bunch of stuff that's interesting and that's worth having a look at in other news posts. The only thing really, I guess, that is new here is that there are a total of 12 divination cards, of which I believe 8 are currently known. In terms of minor content and features, there's a couple of things. There's 2 new Rogue Exiles. This is going to be interesting. These Rogue Exiles are something that haven't stood the test of time very well, but I kind of feel that new ones might. New ones might be quite a bit more dangerous than the existing ones. So let's have a see what happens there. Then there's a bunch of changes where there's dialogue improvements and the like in this section. The Dragon Fireball visuals have been toned down, unfortunately. This is actually fortunate, but it means that there's less of a need to include epilepsy warnings on build showcases that involve the Dragon Fireball. And the reason that they've done this is because the Fireball skill has been buffed to high hell in this patch. Fireball was not really on my radar as a skill I was thinking of playing. I played it only 3 leagues ago. After reading all these patch notes, Fireball is looking pretty damn good. Delirium is being added to the core game, not at 10% like a lot of other things, but at 5%. So 5% of zones that you zone into by default will have a Delirium encounter, but this will increase for every other active every other active league mechanic in the zone. So if you're using a Zana mod, it won't be 5%, it'll be higher. If you're using Scarabs and Sextants, Scarabs and Sextants are going to send this up into the stratosphere. I get the sense that we're going to hit a point where Delirium content is going to be pretty dominant in endgame, but not until quite some time after we've been established at tier 16 for a while. So what I think will happen, if you're playing the game, you know, at your own pace, you will encounter the Delirium Mirror a couple of times while you're working on getting your first 16 Watchstones so that you gain access to high tier maps. Once you get to that point, you will start to see Delirium encounters in more and more and more maps. However, this won't really explode in frequency until you get to the point where you've got all 32 Watchstones, you're regularly killing Cirrus, and your character is dominating maps. At that point, you're going to start having a large collection of Scarabs, and you're then going to start seeing Delirium encounters much, much, much more as a consequence. I think this is an interesting concept. Essentially what it is a way in which we're seeing scaling far beyond the tier 16 cap. I think that something that's been a bugbear for Path of Exile for a while is that tier 16 maps aren't difficult enough once your character is fairly powerful. And delirious maps are something that offer an alternative form of, I guess, content progression that is going to be exciting to put yourself against. And some of the ridiculous things you can do with Delirium, you know, tier 19 Val temples that are 100% delirious, those things are going to be absolutely bonkers, and you can still do that. When you do it, you're going to get showered in cluster jewels, which is going to be useful. One thing that is a consequence of this that's important, though, is that it means that I think cluster jewels, at least cluster jewels that are useful to your character, I think you should not count on having any of them until you are starting to push level 90. You might pick them up, and if you're in a trade league, of course, you'll be able to buy them off other players. But if you're in solo self-found, I think it's quite reasonable to expect that, let's say that you want cold damage over time multiplier, medium cluster jewels. I think it's quite reasonable to expect that you're not going to see one of these until maybe a level 90 or so. And that means that you're going to have to plan a passive tree as though you don't have access to good cluster jewels. Then once you do have access to them, know what to trim off, which will be an easy enough decision, but is just something that's a new aspect to character progression. Character balance. This is the nerfs that we discussed in the last video. Shikari no longer makes you completely immune to poison, but basically halves the effect of poison on you. It's still worth taking when you're entering a hunter-influenced map. And also, if you don't yet know the Alhesman fight, I do have a guide for that on my channel, then the Shikari fight will help you survive some mistakes that you might make on the Alhesman fight. However, it's not something that's... This isn't an absolute gutting of the Pantheon power, but it is quite a nerf. Hexproof, it now acts as immunity effect when you gain it. Yeah, so this is the Headhunter no longer interacts anywhere near as well with Shackles of the Wretched. Discussed this in my discussion of the Balance Manifesto yesterday. But essentially what this means is that the Shackles of the Wretched are now solely to be used in conjunction with Zerfi's Heart. So Zerfi's Heart and Shackles of the Wretched is a thing, or for that matter Zerfi's Heart and Doriani's Prototype, which is a new unique item in this expansion. Those are still viable together. However, Headhunter and Shackles of the Wretched and Self-Cursed Temporal Chains, that is kaput, dead. Dual wielding no longer grants 20% more physical attack damage. This is a slaughterhouse. This is a way, though, of making sure that dual wielding is not strictly better than using a two-hander. It still grants 10% more attack speed and 15% chance to block. Yeah, so this is a significant nerf. I wasn't really expecting it because I I felt like two weapon fighting melee builds were overperforming when compared to two-handed fighting melee builds, but I didn't feel that they were overperforming relative to the whole meta. However, it's not an absolute gutting. It's basically, instead of having 6 effective support gems, you now have about 5.6. Oh, sorry, a 6 link. Instead of a 6 link, you're now down to about a 5.6 link. It's a meaningful loss, but it's not a total gutting. It's certainly not losing an entire support gem, as some people have been claiming online. And I do think that dual wielding will still be very viable, but I would default to playing with a two-hander. If you're thinking of playing a melee character, default to a two-hander, dual wield if it turns out that that's wrong. However, once the Saviour becomes available, despite the fact that the Saviour is getting a little bit of a nerf that's revealed later in the patch notes, once the Saviour becomes available, dual wielding with the Saviour and another good weapon will probably outclass using a two-handed high power weapon like Starforge or a good rare. Okay, so there's a bunch of changes to war cries. These have been really controversial on the Path of Exile subreddit, and I think actually they're looking really good. The Berserker Ascendancy has had a minor rework. The Warcry themed node in the Berserker, I didn't feel it was very good. Some people really liked it, and it's one of those things that's hard to quantify how good it was. But it's been completely gutted and redesigned. So if you like the old version of the Berserker Warcry node, well, sorry. It's been taken out the back and shot, but something else has replaced it that is pretty good. And what that is, I will quickly bring up in 1 second. And here we are. This is the changed nodes in the Berserker. So the big news here is that Warcries grant 5 rage per 5 power. Now, power is a measure of how many nearby enemies there are, if you have less than 25 rage. Now, power I believe to be 20 if you are near a unique enemy, at least one unique enemy. If you're near multiple unique enemies, then that can be higher again. So if you were to fire off a Warcry whilst you were toe-to-toe with Atsuri, then you're going to gain 20 power. If you were toe-to-toe with Atsuri's trio, 3 bosses, you're going to gain 60. You're going to gain 60 rage, which is going to completely fill your rage bar. Now, Warcries sacrifice 25 rage if you have at least 25 rage. So if you've got 0 to 24, this generates rage. If you've got 25 plus, this consumes it. And it consumes it for a massive benefit, which is exerted attacks deal 50% more damage if a Warcry sacrificed rage recently. Now, it's important to note that Warcries have a cast time, or a shout time, or whatever you want to call it. And this puts a severe limitation on this Berserker node. There's been a bunch of people that have done some maths on what's the absolute maximum you can sustain the skill Berserk for, in conjunction with using Warbringer optimally. Their conclusion, which I don't actually think is a sensible play pattern, is that you can sustain Warbringer using Warbringer, you can sustain Berserk for 28 seconds. That requires the Berserk helmet enchant. However, I don't actually think that's the way you want to do it. The way I think you should play with Warbringer is that you should fire off Warbringer first, then immediately cast Berserk, then start laying into the enemy and getting the benefit of this massive exerted attack dealing 50% more damage if a Warcry sacrificed rage recently. Once you start getting quite low on rage, fire off a Warcry. The idea being that you want to keep Berserk going for as long as it is worth keeping going. But you don't want to keep it going for as long as is humanly possible. Then, whenever your rage falls below about 20 or so, you're going to want to set off another Warcry, interrupt your attacking, set off another Warcry. This play pattern is going to have a very high skill ceiling, but I do think it's going to reward players that master it very well. Then eventually, after about 15 or 16 seconds of berserking, assuming you've got the helm enchant, maybe only 10 or 12 if you don't, what you're going to want to do is let Berserk run its course. As soon as Berserk expires, you're going to want to fire off a Warcry immediately so that you gain some rage. And then, Berserk goes on a 5-second cooldown. Well, you know what? That's 5 seconds in which you're just going to play a careful game of not relying upon the extra physical damage reduction that Berserker gives you. So I think that's going to be really exciting to play around with, and it is one of the things that is making me lean towards maybe considering a Ground Slam Berserker as a league starter. So, that is the Warcry changes. There's a bunch of individual Warcry changes. Discussed this previously. There's not much more to say on them. There's a couple of small things. There's changes that have happened to brands. Again, these got their own video. Brands are still looking like they could be fairly strong. However, because Archmage support still works on them, it is going to be a case of you must use Archmage, otherwise brands are going to suck. I feel that that's the case. I'm open to being proven wrong. Some people have said that Armageddon brand has been buffed considerably, but I do feel that the best way to use Armageddon brand looks like it's going to be to use Archmage support and to use the Stormfire unique ring. Now, that is a problem with the fact that Archmage still works on brands. Archmage should have had its numbers increased and not been able to work with brands or Orb of Storms. Okay, so we have slams, that's just a definition, and there's a couple of changes to totems there. There's a number of skill changes. I only want to discuss the ones that I think are big. Armageddon brand is just getting better numbers all around. This skill is essentially Firestorm, but mechanically a little bit better. And so it's essentially it's Firestorm that follows one enemy around to some extent. All the numbers on it are better. All of them are actually much better, except for this detached duration. And I think overall, Armageddon brand, it wasn't amazing before, but it might just be there now. I do, however, think that because it's got such an Ignite synergy, it may be that Stormfire is the way to use it. And in which case, I'm sure people will mess around with that. I'm not intending to touch Armageddon brand, but I do think it will be good. Now, Ball Lightning is interesting. All you see here are buffs, and so a lot of people think, oh my god, Ball Lightning has just been sort of buffed into the stratosphere when it was already a bustedly powerful skill. Now, Ball Lightning, a lot of its power is tied up in its interaction with a slower projectile support. Slower projectile support is getting nerfed pretty hard. Additionally, a lot of Ball Lightning's power is tied up in critical strikes, and critical strike multiplier sources are generally being reduced by about 30% across the board. Overall, I feel that a 6-link Ball Lightning will outclass a 5-link Ball Lightning on live, and will be weaker than a 6-link Ball Lightning on live. It will be sort of, let's call it a 5.6-link Ball Lightning on live. And most of that is going to be due to the nerfs to critical strike multiplier. These are not going to gut the skill. They're just a moderate tuning. And I think the Ball Lightning is going to remain a very powerful league starter. The most popular way of using Ball Lightning is in conjunction with Blast Chain Mine support or High Impact Mine support. And that's going to remain the case. Ball Lightning mines are looking absurd still. Okay, so we have the changes to brand recall discussed before. Cyclone again has been discussed already. Earthquake. Earthquake's interesting in that it's got a buff disguised as a nerf here. Now, maybe it's a little bit of an exaggeration to call this a buff, but there was a lot of discussion on Reddit saying that the reduction of the radius of the base hit was an absolute game over for the skill. However, there's a new node on the passive tree called the Impaler, and Earthquake has a lot of synergy with it. What it does, the Impaler allows you to, instead of being able to impale on every hit, you can only impale an enemy once per 4 seconds, but the impales you inflict count 5 times at once. So with slow attacks, such as Earthquake, and particularly Earthquake's Aftershock, the Impaler is an incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful effect. And the fact that Earthquake doesn't hit with its original hit. So with Earthquake, if you're not familiar with the skill, it's a 1-2 punch. The first punch is a small area hit, and then the second punch is a massive area surrounding you. The Aftershock, the second hit, does the big damage. and this is going to work extremely well with the Impaler Keystone. So for that reason, I don't actually think this is a nerf at all. I think it is a change in how Earthquake is going to be used. The only way I feel Earthquake is viable is in conjunction with the Impaler Keystone on the tree and a pure physical setup, but that's probably the best way to scale the skill anyway. Okay, next we get to the big one, Fireball. I played Fireball in Blight League. Fireball was really good. Fireball had lots of damage, it always felt. Well, Fireball is getting much more damage. Much more damage. Much more damage. So, at a damage effectiveness of 240%, up from 180%. This means that any damage that you get on gear is going to have 1/3 more effect on Fireball than it used to have. This is amazing. This means that things like Immolate support might become viable, although I need to check the numbers on that. It also means that there's just so many other good things, like Fireball is looking really strong. No longer gains additional explosion radius as the gem levels up, but wait. Now gains additional explosion radius based upon the distance the projectile has travelled as the gem levels up to +9 at gem level 20. So, it's important to say a couple of words about the way that Fireball works. With Fireball, you lob a small ball of fire at an enemy. When it strikes that enemy, it explodes, and the explosion currently is a fixed size. If that projectile that you fired pierces the enemy, instead it deals damage to that enemy as though it exploded, but then it just goes straight through them without exploding. So, the idea with Fireball is that if you want maximum coverage, the best way to get it, somewhat counterintuitively, is to use projectile spread methods like fork support, or awaken fork support at the higher end. With these, you'll hit the first enemy, the projectile will be destroyed, because that's what happens when projectiles fork, and then 2 new projectiles will be created. However, the projectile that was destroyed will set off an explosion that will damage all nearby enemies. Also, potentially, because it's dealing fire damage, it's got a good chance to ignite them. So, what we're seeing here is that the explosion radius is going to be proportional to the distance between you and the enemy that you're striking, which means that when enemies are further away, which with Fireball characters, you generally want to hit enemies before they get close to you, you will be able to do devastating damage to an entire pack of monsters. Additionally, you're probably going to want to use this in conjunction with Ignite proliferation support on most builds. However, this might make it more viable to build a Fireball character based upon the initial hit. Additionally, the quality bonus is changing. Previously it was 10% chance to ignite for a 20 quality Fireball. That is being replaced with 20% increased projectile speed. Projectile speed, trust me, is really good on Fireball. Chance to ignite is something that, although it's good in theory, in practice you get more than 100% of it anyway. Firestorm. Firestorm deals more damage. No one cared because the skill is still bad, I think. At least that's my thoughts. Maybe someone will try and use it, maybe someone will find a use for it, but I don't think it's going to get there. Freezing Pulse and Frostbolt, getting numerical buffs, maybe that'll help them. Ground Slam. Ground Slam is being transformed a bit. In Legion, Grinding Gear Games made an experiment where they gave a number of skills flat physical damage in exchange for them losing a little bit of their weapon scaling. The idea here was they wanted to close the gap a little bit between lower end gear and higher end gear. So the difference between having a 250 DPS two-handed axe and a 550 DPS two-handed axe, and then maybe a mirror tier 870 DPS two-handed axe. They wanted to close that gap over time by making it so that a lot of these gems had flat physical damage on them. What happened was something unexpected. Facebreaker. Facebreaker broke this system. Facebreaker's ability to essentially get 9 times the benefit of this flat physical damage meant that a whole number of skills that dealt physical damage could no longer have this flat added physical. So Facebreaker has claimed a casualty here in Ground Slam. Ground Slam no longer has added attack physical damage. This is a consequence of Facebreaker being able to be used unarmed. Oh, sorry, of Ground Slam being able to be used unarmed. However, it now gains a higher damage effectiveness. So this is a flat 20% increase, roughly, in the amount of damage the skill gem does. Where do I think this puts Ground Slam? It means that it scales higher at the highest end. It also means that it will perform worse with god-awful weapons. In practice, I think it will be pretty much a wash. I think Ground Slam is still a very realistic choice, even for League Start, but will probably be something that's better to return to on a second character. I'm tentatively planning that I'm going to start with a Vile Fireball character and then roll a second character, which will be a Vile Ground Slam character, but I haven't made up my mind for certain yet. Herald of Purity I discussed yesterday. It is another Facebreaker interaction. Facebreaker was broken with Herald of Purity, therefore Facebreaker has the Facebreaker and Herald of Purity interaction has been killed. This means that Herald of Purity is still pretty good, but it is going to be pretty much exclusive to armed physical attacks. Or for that matter, to physical damage spells, which aren't that popular at the moment, but it does work with them. Okay, so there's a number of other skills that have had some modest changes along the way. Stormbrand we've discussed already. Stormbrand looks like it's got mostly buffs, but there's been some other nerfs to brands that are going to take that out of the question. Vile skill balance, we have Vile Fireball has gained everything that Fireball gained, and Ground Slam has had similar changes to Vile Ground Slam has had similar changes to Ground Slam, except its numbers got even better. It did lose a little bit of attack speed, but overall I think Vile Ground Slam is looking really good. Vile Ground Slam, if you've never played with this skill before, it's the sort of thing that lets a lowly geared character unleash massive stuns on bosses that you just never thought you'd be able to stun. I know that I was stunning, when I was playing in Legion, I had a character that was really struggling with tier 14 maps at the time, was really struggling with bosses, not dealing very much damage at all. It was my League starter, and it was not in a good shape. Vile Ground Slam, however, I had it in a 4 link. I had Cyclone in my 6 link, and Vile Ground Slam in my 4 link, and Vile Ground Slam would stun pretty much every boss that I was fighting, tier 16 map boss, stun, and then I'd be able to deal with them with Cyclone. So Vile Ground Slam was exceptional there. That was in a 4 link, but now I think it's good enough to 6 link because both Ground Slam and Vile Ground Slam are looking really good, and you get both of them for free when you, when you 6 link a Ground Slam, but it happens to be a Vile Ground Slam gem, you get Vile Ground Slam for free. Let's just say that when we get down to Vile Molten Shell has been taken out the back and it has been shot. It hasn't been put out of its misery nicely either. This isn't a single quick bullet to the head. This is 3 to the stomach to give it time to think on everything that it's done in its life. Then 1 to the neck, and then 2 to the head. Vile Molten Shell is dead. No one is going to use this gem anymore, which, to be honest, I think is probably overall for the better of the game. But I think that the same idea of making Vile Molten Shell no longer enticing to use could have been achieved by changing, instead of having this be an 80% down to 35% nerf, had this been an 80% to 65% nerf. I think that would have been sufficient to solve all the balance issues with Vile Molten Shell, but leave it as something that might have some fringe uses. As it is, dead, kaput. Gem no longer exists. If it drops for you, delete it. Don't pick it up. Archmage support, as I've already said, it's so broken with brands that it is going to be judged based upon brands. It is so broken with Orb of Storms that it is going to be judged based on Orb of Storms. I think that it is still strong in those niches, and it is still useless everywhere else. Slow projectile support. This nerf here is significant, and it's one of the 2 reasons Ball Lightning isn't over. Passive tree balance. There's a lot hidden here. So if you click here, you can download a .json file, which can be opened by various Path of Exile related third-party tools. And the key things that have changed in terms of the passive tree. There's no change to the overarching structure of the passive tree. There's just a few new nodes. Your old builds should all work, although some of the old nodes are no longer appealing to take anymore. Pretty much every source of critical strike multiplier has been decreased in power by about 30%. So if your character was getting 500% critical strike multiplier all told, so 150% baseline, 350% from the tree, you can expect that instead of that 350% from the tree, you might be looking at 245%, which will be 395% overall. Ergo, you're doing about 20% less damage with every critical hit. Critical strike multiplier is, critical strike builds are still in a good place, and I feel that critical strike is going to feel, it's not going to be the no-brainer decision it used to be, but I still feel it's going to be the objectively right decision for most builds. In hardcore, it will be more of a question. Okay, in terms of other key changes, the broken herald nodes have been also dispatched with extreme prejudice. So Purposeful Harbinger is still fine as long as you only take one of them, or if you take two of them. There's no point in stacking more than that. The way that Purposeful Harbinger was changed, so now instead of giving 10% aura effect per herald on you, it gives you 8% aura effect per herald on you, but there is an absolute hard cap of 40% aura effect that you can gain. And this is independent of the number of Purposeful Harbinger nodes you have. So if you have 3 Purposeful Harbinger nodes and 3 heralds, even though you're getting 8% aura effect from each of the heralds, you might think, oh yeah, that's that's 24% per Purposeful Harbinger for a total of 72%. Nah, hard capped at 40. So for this reason, I think that the main way that you might consider using Purposeful Harbinger is to run 3 heralds on a build that already wants to run 3 heralds. There are some of these. Blade Vortex comes to mind. And you will then, so you run your 3 heralds, and then that's basically the extent of it. 2 Purposeful Harbingers, you get 40% aura effect. That's worth taking, but it's not extraordinary. Endbringer, on the other hand, is dead. Endbringer was the node that used to give 25% overall damage to you for each herald that's affecting you. So essentially this one node was 125% bonus to damage if you had all 5 heralds. Now that is being nerfed to 25% for the first one and 5% for each additional. Needless to say, Endbringer is just dead. I don't think there's any real... You would allocate it on a build if your cluster jewel already has it, and if you are already running 2 heralds or more, especially if you're running 3, but you're not going to try and roll it. Okay, so from the other changes, there's been a few changes to Timeless Jewels, and they've had some new nodes made available, and some of the existing nodes have been transferred onto the normal passive tree. Glancing Blows is one that is particularly good. This is the one that gives you half the effectiveness of each block that you do. So you still take, instead of taking no damage, you take half damage, but your block chance is doubled. Glancing Blows is really good, and it's now much easier to get. Okay, so we also have the new keystones discussed already. Okay, in terms of Ascendancy changes, the Chieftain has had some modest changes, nothing transformative. The Berserker we've already discussed, moderately significant changes to Warbringer, and it is still, if Berserker was your Ascendancy previously, it still is. There's no reason to consider changing it over it. And I think for some people, this will pull you into Berserker where you previously weren't planning on it. So there's a bunch of Labyrinth helmets that have been depreciated. They've been removed from the game. There's also one interesting thing here, Essence of Hysteria on boots. So this is the one that causes you to create Burning Ground that affects enemies. This now drops Burning Ground every 10 units instead of every 25. This is going to be interesting. I still don't think it's going to be good, but I do think it's going to be fun. Do you think it's going to be a lot of fun? We're just going to have to find out how it works out. There are new influence mods, Elder Slayer influence mods to several slots. We're going to have to find out what these are. So Elder Slayer ones mean there's not Shaper or Elder ones. They're Crusader, Redeemer, Warlord, and Hunter. We don't know what they are. We're going to find this out when they get data mined, which will probably be in the 2 to 3 hours before the launch of the league. Okay, there's a bunch of changes to two-handed weapons. Overall, what's happening with two-handed weapons is that they're getting individual identities to each other, which is going to be great, and they're, broadly speaking, a bit better. However, the two-handed unique items are getting nerfed to mostly keep them back in the same place they were in before. Cluster Duel rebalance we've already talked about. Endbringer has been really, really gutted, which I think is a good thing. I think it's going to make the game more fun. Unique item changes, a whole lot of information there about the two-handers that are being nerfed in their explicit mods to make up for the fact that their base, the base stats on them are getting better. Other uniques, Envy is really interesting. So Envy is an aura that you can't normally get. It's not a skill gem. You get it by either equipping the unique United in Dream, which is a Chayula unique, or by equipping the unique All's Uprising, which drops from All, Crystal King, down in the deepest areas of the Delve Mine, or potentially from a high item level Elder Amulet. And this is now getting an interesting unique mod added to it. So the aura adds flat chaos damage, but what it's going to get is a new mod that all sources of chaos damage that you get, that all sources of added chaos damage that you get are rounded up by 3/4. So this means that if you're using added chaos damage support, essentially this is going to be like having +5 levels on your added chaos damage support gem, or something like that. This is going to be really good. I think that Envy is looking like it's got some serious prospects to be good at this point. Number of other changes here. Arborix has just been completely redesigned, and I'm not really going to go into whether this is good or not yet. That's going to take a lot of thought. There is an interesting thing on the Red Blade unique shield, which we'll get to in a sec. The Red Blade banner has the mod now causes war cries to have infinite power. So what this means is that you get the absolute maximum number possible on any numerical effect your war cries could have. So if your war cry is granting you X endurance charges based upon the number of nearby enemies, it's going to push you to full endurance charges straight away. This one's going to be interesting. Number of other changes. Rolling Flames, the Fireball Jewel has been transformed, and it's something that is going to be like it's gone from a must-have to a you might want this if you are playing a Fireball build that doesn't plan to ignite. So do keep this item in mind, but it's no longer what it used to be. And yeah, there's a number of other changes there, nothing particularly extraordinary. There's a number of changes to stun mechanics. I discussed that yesterday in the Balance Manifesto overhaul, and there's not really a huge amount of interesting information there. It's just stuff we already knew. Now, there's a total overhaul of the Atlas, and of particular note, Burial Chambers and Tower, the two best sources of divination cards that lead to Headhunter, are now map levels 15, so tier 15 maps. This means that any bad tier 15 map that you get is going to be worth throwing a Horizon Orb on it. Not just one Horizon Orb, keep Horizing it until you get a Burial Chambers or a Tower. There will be people who want those Burial Chambers and those Towers. There's a little bit of information about quest rewards here. This is worth your while familiarizing yourself with, especially if there is a new gem that you decide that you want. So for instance, if you decide you wanted to play Earth Shatter, one of the new skill gems, load up as a marauder or duelist, and you'll get it when you get close to Merveil. Lastly, there's a bunch of bug fixes. There's always bug fixes, and there's also always undocumented new bugs that are added. Finally, there's a couple of little changes. Molten Strike has had a couple of tweaks to its numbers. I'm going to have to leave the assessing of this to people who are experts in this, and there are some fantastic changes to hideout interfaces. Anyway, that's all for the changes that, or for the announcements that have been made in the patch notes. In terms of my final thoughts, Fireball is looking amazing. Tricks to Ignite Fireball is something I played in 3.8. It was a good build then. It's looking a lot better now. It also gained a fair bit in 3.9 with new influence types too. So yeah, Fireball is going to be really good. Even if you don't intend to play Fireball yourself, it's worth your while familiarizing yourself with the sort of gear that Fireball characters might want to use, because if you get the Searing Touch drop for you, that unique staff, on day one especially, you're going to want to sell it because there's going to be huge demand for that item. The second build that I think is going to be good is Ball Lightning Mines. Ball Lightning Mines, I was expecting them to be cracked in both kneecaps by the nerf bat. Instead, I think they might just have like a stub toe. They're not looking as strong as they were, but they were so strong already that, you know, losing a little bit of power here or there is not a big deal. The third thing is that I'm quite partial to Ground Slam. I think that Ground Slam is looking like it's in a good place. Not so much because of anything new that's here, but because of the fact that Vile Ground Slam is so good with the stun changes and with the with the whole new idea of let players stun bosses, but as long as the boss gets a free period to counterattack them later. I think that this is going to create a situation where Vile Ground Slam is really good. Additionally, the new sources of increased AoE for melee attacks are going to help it a lot. So Ground Slam / Vile Ground Slam is something I'm keen to experiment with. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. If you've got any comments or questions, fire away below. Otherwise, I hope you have a good one.